The China incident began as a small-scale clash between Japanese and Chinese troops, but before long it had turned into a full-scale war, one that lacked both planning and strategy. Worse still, it was driven by local military units on the ground, leaving the government unable to exercise control. It was, by any measure, an abnormal situation. In March 1938, the National Mobilization Law was enacted, putting Japan under a wartime regime. This law curtailed the power of the Diet and transferred authority to the cabinet, allowing it to mobilize labor and resources without parliamentary approval. As a result, the production of daily necessities and food was pushed aside, putting a growing strain on civilian life. At the same time, criticism from the military and from the international community, which condemned Japan's ongoing war in China, forced Japan to give up hosting both the Tokyo Olympics and the World Expo, originally scheduled to be held 2 years later. Meanwhile, in July 1939, the United States, claiming that Japan was infringing upon American commercial rights in China, notified Japan that it would terminate the U.S.-Japan Treaty of Commerce and Navigation 6 months later. In September 1939, Germany's invasion of Poland prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany, marking the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Around the summer of 1938, moves were already underway to strengthen the anti-Comintern Pact among Germany, Italy, and Japan. Emperor Showa, concerned about this development, recommended Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, who opposed a formal alliance with Germany and Italy, to serve as prime minister. Thus, the Yonai cabinet was formed in January 1940. It was unprecedented for the emperor to personally name someone for the post of prime minister. In May 1940, German forces captured Paris and occupied 3/5 of France. The following month after France's surrender, Italy declared war on Britain and France and joined Germany's side. Amid these events, voices in Japan grew louder, warning that the nation must not be left behind. Under pressure from the army, which launched a campaign to bring down the cabinet, the Yonai government, cautious about joining the Axis alliance, resigned after only 6 months. In July, Prince Konoe Fumimaro returned as prime minister. During his second term, the Konoe cabinet announced the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere as a national policy. The idea was to free Asian nations from Western colonial rule and build a region of mutual independence and prosperity. In reality, however, it placed Japan at the center of this new order, and it faced resistance from some local populations. In response to Japan's expanding ambitions, the United States and Britain began stepping up their support for the Republic of China, providing military supplies and other aid. Believing it necessary to cut off the main supply route, the French Indochina route, Japan decided to move its troops into northern French Indochina, today's northern Vietnam, on September 23, 1940. Just 4 days later, on September 27th, Japan formally signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. In retaliation, the United States imposed an embargo on iron exports to Japan. For Japan to focus on southern expansion, it first needed to secure its northern flank and improve relations with the Soviet Union. In April 1941, with Germany acting as mediator, Japan signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. Yet only 2 months later, Germany broke its own non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and launched an invasion. Within Japan, some argued that, as Germany's ally, Japan should attack the Soviet Union from the east, but Prime Minister Konoe rejected the idea. Seeking to repair relations with the United States, he continued negotiations even as Japan prepared to secure the resources it needed by moving troops into southern French Indochina that July. This decision further worsened relations with the United States. Washington responded by freezing Japanese assets in the U.S., and in August imposed a total embargo on oil exports. Britain and the Netherlands soon followed, joining with China to form a four-nation economic blockade against Japan. Japan had been importing 76.7% of its oil from the United States, and another 14.5% from the Dutch East Indies, meaning it effectively lost 91.2% of its total oil supply overnight. In September 1941, an imperial conference was held in the presence of Emperor Showa. It was decided that while negotiations with the U.S. would continue, the Army and Navy would simultaneously prepare for war. If talks failed to reach an agreement by early October, Japan would move to open hostilities. During the meeting, Emperor Showa twice recited an imperial poem by Emperor Meiji. Across the four seas all are brothers. Why then do the waves and winds of strife rage in this world? Under the Meiji Constitution, the emperor was prohibited from directly intervening in politics, so by reading this poem, he implicitly expressed his wish to avoid war. Japan continued seeking a meeting between Prime Minister Konoe and President Roosevelt, hoping to avert war, but the U.S. government refused. Then, on October 15th, an incident shocked the Konoe administration. Ozaki Hatsumi, one of Konoe's closest aides, was arrested after being exposed as a member of a Soviet spy network. Ozaki had played a key role in several major government decisions, from ending the 1937 peace talks with China, mediated by the German ambassador, Trautmann, to approving Japan's move into southern Indochina. With the cabinet divided between those pushing for immediate war and those still opposing it, Konoe's government resigned on October 18th. Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Kido Koichi, seeking someone capable of restraining the army's hardliners, unilaterally recommended Army Minister Tojo Hideki for the post of Prime Minister, and the Emperor approved. Tojo, a career officer who had served as Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army, was aligned with the pro-war faction, but he also placed great weight on the Emperor's wishes. Upon becoming Prime Minister, he was required to nullify the entire Imperial Conference resolution and reset the discussion from scratch. He proposed a two-stage compromise plan that included significant concessions to American demands, but at the same time set a final deadline for peace negotiations. December 1st. Then, on November 27th, Japan received a memorandum that disregarded the entire course of negotiations so far. This was the so-called Hull Note, named after U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull. It demanded Japan's complete withdrawal from China and French Indochina, recognition of Chiang Kai-shek's government as the legitimate one in China, and the abandonment of the Tripartite Pact, terms Japan could never accept. The following day, Japanese ambassadors Nomura Kichisaburo and Kurusu Saburo met with President Roosevelt, but no resolution was reached. In a world still governed by the brutal logic of might makes right, non-white nations were endlessly exploited. To accept the Hull Note, many in Japan believed, would be tantamount to sitting still and waiting for death. Even those who had been reluctant to go to war changed their minds almost overnight. Tojo, too, gave up on further negotiation and decided on December 1st to go to war. By this time, the U.S. had already been decoding Japanese naval and diplomatic communications since 1940. Washington had an accurate picture of Japan's internal situation, including the fact that Japan did not truly wish for war and where its breaking point lay. President Roosevelt, who was already inclined toward war, deliberately maneuvered events so that Japan would be the one to make the first move. On December 8, 1941, Japan's naval air forces launched an attack on the U.S. fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. With this surprise strike, the Second World War, until then centered in Europe, expanded into the Asia-Pacific region. Due to a delay at the Japanese embassy in Washington, the official declaration of war arrived after the attack had already begun. President Franklin D. Roosevelt condemned Japan for carrying out a cowardly assault without warning, stirring public outrage and rallying the American people toward war almost overnight. That same day, Japan also began its southern operation. Japanese forces quickly advanced through British Malaya and Singapore, the American-controlled Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, defeating Western troops one after another. Japan had opened war simultaneously against the United States and Britain in order to seize the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies. To do that, it needed to destroy British forces in Singapore and neutralize America's Clark Air Base in the Philippines, which lay along the route Japan would need to transport oil through the East China Sea. The strike on Pearl Harbor shared the same objective: to weaken American military power. 4 days after the war began, on December 12th, the Japanese government officially decided to call this conflict, including the ongoing war in China, the Greater East Asia War. Japan then signed an alliance with Thailand and declared that all the territories it had brought under its control across Asia, including Korea and Taiwan, already incorporated as Japanese territories since the Meiji era, as well as Manchukuo, eastern China where a pro-Japanese government had been established, and other regions, would together form the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In Burma and India, local nationalist armies fighting for independence from Britain joined forces with the advancing Japanese troops. At first, Japan seemed to hold the upper hand, but on June 7, 1942, at the Battle of Midway, Japan suffered a crushing defeat, losing 4 aircraft carriers and 1 heavy cruiser, a turning point that reversed the balance of power between Japan and the United States. 2 months later, on August 7th, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, marking the beginning of a long and grueling counteroffensive. In May 1943, the Battle of Attu took place in the Aleutian Islands, further tightening the U.S. advance. On November 5, 1943, amid these worsening conditions, Japan convened the Greater East Asia Conference to promote smoother administration across occupied territories. It was the first international summit in history attended exclusively by leaders of non-white nations. At the conference, the Greater East Asia Joint Declaration was adopted, calling for cooperation and mutual prosperity among Asian nations. Although the situation at the front was deteriorating, the government concealed the grim reality from the public. Even as daily life grew increasingly difficult, ordinary people endured the hardships and continued to pray for victory. In June 1944, the U.S. began its invasion of the Mariana Islands. With the fall of Saipan and Guam, Japan itself came within range of the American B-29 long-range bombers, and full-scale air raids on Japanese cities began. More than 300 B-29s carried out a massive bombing raid on Tokyo, burning about 40% of the city and killing roughly 100,000 civilians in a single night. Tokyo would be bombed more than 100 times thereafter, and in total, about 400 cities, towns, and villages across Japan would be devastated by air raids. In July 1944, after the Mariana Islands, Japan's so-called absolute defense zone, were breached, Prime Minister Tojo and his cabinet resigned to take responsibility. The new cabinet, formed under Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso, outwardly declared a policy of total resistance, but quietly began preparing for Japan's defeat by appointing several anti-war figures to key positions. In the Philippines, Japan had established a pro-Japanese government. However, General Douglas MacArthur, who had commanded U.S. forces there before Japan's occupation, was determined to reclaim the Philippines. Under Japanese military rule, shortages of goods and rampant inflation worsened daily life, turning public sentiment against Japan. Escaped American prisoners were ordered to assist the growing Filipino guerrilla movement, which eventually reached over 270,000 fighters, including communist-led groups. In October 1944, MacArthur landed on Leyte Island, and fierce battles erupted between U.S. and Japanese forces. Japanese troops found themselves caught between American forces and guerrillas who blended into the civilian population. The cornered Japanese forces began their assault without distinguishing between soldiers and civilians, resulting in the massacre of many non-combatants, not only Filipinos but also others. As Japan's situation grew desperate, the military resorted to an unprecedented tactic in human history: the kamikaze suicide attacks, in which pilots deliberately crashed their planes into enemy ships. The practice later spread beyond the Philippines, claiming the lives of more than 6,000 Japanese pilots. In March 1945, Iwo Jima fell. Then, on April 1st, U.S. forces began their invasion of Okinawa. On April 7th, the Yamato, the world's largest battleship, was sunk off Tokunoshima in Kagoshima Prefecture by concentrated U.S. air attacks while en route to Okinawa. After nearly 3 months of fierce fighting, about 94,000 Japanese soldiers, 12,000 American troops, and another 94,000 civilians had lost their lives. In February 1945, the leaders of the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union met at the Yalta Conference to discuss post-war arrangements. There, a secret agreement was made. The Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's surrender, in exchange for the return of southern Karafuto and the Chieshima Islands. On April 7, 1945, with no effective strategy left, the Koiso cabinet resigned. Emperor Hirohito personally persuaded Kantaro Suzuki to become prime minister, and serious moves toward ending the war began. Just days later, on April 12th, President Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage, and Vice President Harry Truman succeeded him. By April 30th, Adolf Hitler had taken his own life, and Germany surrendered soon after. Japan now stood as the only Axis power still fighting. On July 12th, unaware of the secret Yalta Agreement, Japan asked the Soviet Union to mediate peace negotiations, but Moscow's responses were evasive and insincere, leaving Japan wasting precious time. On July 16th, the United States successfully carried out the first nuclear test in human history. The very next day, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin convened at the Potsdam Conference, during which Stalin promised to enter the war against Japan by mid-August. However, after Truman informed him of America's successful atomic bomb development on July 24th, Stalin ordered the invasion timetable to be moved up, so the Soviet Union could join the war before the bomb was used. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender. An earlier draft had guaranteed the emperor's position, but President Truman deleted that clause just before its release. Several officials, including Joseph Grew, argued that Japan was already seeking peace and that this assurance would guarantee its surrender. But there were powerful figures in Washington determined to use the atomic bomb. On August 6th, the atomic bomb Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9th, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion of Manchuria and Korea, leaving Japan's leaders stunned by the betrayal. That same day, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 10th, Japan's Supreme War Council convened. The debate split evenly between those favoring acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and those insisting on continued resistance, resulting in deadlock. At that point, Prime Minister Suzuki turned to Emperor Hirohito and said, "Your Majesty, we would like to hear your will so that we may unify our opinions." The emperor broke his silence and declared, "I agree to accept the declaration." His decision brought the war to an end. Fully aware that he might be executed as a war criminal, the emperor addressed his weeping ministers. "If we continue fighting on the mainland, the Japanese people may be annihilated. How could we then pass down our nation to future generations? My duty is to preserve this country, inherited from our ancestors, for our descendants. At this point, the only way to do that is for as many Japanese as possible to survive and one day rise again. If that can be achieved, then my own fate does not matter." On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's Gyokuon Hoso, the imperial rescript on the termination of the war, was broadcast to the nation, announcing Japan's surrender.
政府をして米英四蘇四国に対しその共同宣言を受諾する旨通告せしめたり